At first light, on September 20th, 1944, a thin veil of fog crawled across the farmland near Haraucourt, France, turning the battlefield into a silent, colorless maze on a muddy forward airstrip. Major Charles Carpenter crouched beside a fragile Piper L for Grasshopper, its fabric wings damp with morning mist. He was 32 years old, a former high school history teacher from Illinois, a man who once explained wars from textbooks and chalkboards. Now he was about to fly directly into one. German Panther tanks were advancing through the fog, steel giants hunting American units already stretched thin and bleeding. The German 5th Panzer Army had thrown hundreds of tanks into the region, and American Shermans were burning across the fields like funeral pyres. The L-4 Grasshopper was never meant for this. It was an observation plane, slow and light, powered by a modest engine, and usually ignored by enemy gunners. Its job was to watch, report, and survive. Carpenter had done that for months, circling overhead while tank crews died below him, trapped inside metal coffins they could not escape. He watched men burn. He watched turrets launch into the air after ammunition and every time, all he could do was radio coordinates and wait. That helplessness hardened into resolve, so Carpenter made a decision that defied doctrine and common sense. He bolted 6 bazookas onto the wings of his Grasshopper. Each rocket added weight the aircraft was never designed to carry. By the numbers alone, the plane was dangerously overloaded. No one could say for certain whether the rocket exhaust would ignite the fabric wings, or whether the aircraft could pull out of a combat dive. Other pilots called it suicide. Carpenter called it necessary. On September 18th, the fog had betrayed the Americans. German tanks used it to close in, destroying Sherman after Sherman before the crews could even fire back. Carpenter watched one tank explode so violently its turret flew dozens of feet through the air. He watched a burning loader stumble out and collapse after a few steps. That image followed him everywhere. By the morning of the 20th, he was done watching. He climbed into the cockpit alone. No observer, no backup. Just 18 rockets, a trembling aircraft, and a decision already made. The engine sputtered, caught, and dragged the overloaded plane into the gray sky. Fog swallowed the ground beneath him as he climbed, knowing that by noon he would either be dead or prove that a fabric-covered observation plane could hunt tanks. And as the fog slowly began to thin, Carpenter searched below for the first hint of German armor, fully aware that once he attacked, observation planes would never be ignored again. The moment he found his target, everything would change. By mid-morning, the fog began to tear itself apart in uneven patches, revealing strips of farmland, hedgerows, and narrow roads glistening with moisture. Carpenter dropped lower, scanning with intense focus. This was no longer reconnaissance. This was hunting. At around 11 o'clock, movement caught his eye, northeast of Haraucourt. Dark shapes slid along a road lined with trees. Panther tanks. 6 of them at least, maybe more, advancing with infantry and support. They were moving straight toward American positions that barely had time to breathe. Carpenter checked his fuel. Enough for 1 attack, maybe 2, if luck stayed close. The bazookas mounted to his wings were angled upward, which meant he could not simply fire from level flight. To aim, he had to point the entire aircraft at the target and dive. Get close, very close. German infantry were no longer harmless spectators once that happened. He climbed for position, putting the sun behind him, then pushed the nose down. The Grasshopper accelerated, the wind screaming over the wings, the added weight making every control input feel heavy and delayed. The tanks grew rapidly in his windscreen. At roughly 100 meters, Carpenter fired his first rocket. The launch jolted the aircraft violently as a tongue of flame blasted backward inches from the fabric wing. He pulled up hard, too hard for a plane that did not want to climb. Gunfire erupted from below. Rifle rounds snapped past the cockpit. Fabric tore. The grasshopper clawed upward anyway, sluggish but stubborn. When Carpenter leveled off, he looked back. One Panther had stopped moving, smoke curling from its engine deck. Not destroyed, but crippled, enough to slow the column and force the Germans to scatter. For the first time, they were reacting to an observation plane as if it were a real threat. Carpenter did not linger. He turned back toward his forward strip, skimming low over terrain to avoid drawing fire. When he landed, the ground crew stared at the bullet holes stitched through the wings and tail. Then they saw the empty launcher. The idea had worked, barely. The wings were scorched but intact. The grasshopper had survived. 14 minutes later, the plane was Carpenter was already climbing back into the cockpit. The Germans were still out there, regrouping, adjusting, learning. When he took off again, just after noon, visibility had improved and the battlefield was exposed. He did not have long before the enemy adapted completely. As he turned back toward the fighting, Carpenter knew the next engagement would be different. The surprise was gone. The Germans would be waiting, and waiting enemies were far more dangerous than unaware ones. As Carpenter pushed east again, the landscape unfolded clearly beneath him. The fog was mostly gone now, and with it any illusion of safety. Roads, tree lines, and scattered villages lay exposed under a pale sky. At 12:40, he spotted another armored formation moving along a narrow route near Bazooka. This one was larger. 8 Panther tanks, infantry riding and marching alongside them. This was not a probing force. It was a flanking move, aimed at collapsing American positions before artillery could respond. Carpenter radioed the coordinates, but he already knew the problem. Artillery took time. German tanks did not. By the time shells landed, these Panthers would be somewhere else, or worse, sitting on top of American troops. He made the decision instantly. He would attack again. He climbed, repositioned, and rolled into another dive. This time the Germans were ready. Machine gun fire rose to meet him almost immediately, tracers stitching the air where his plane had been moments before. Carpenter fired, pulled up, and felt a hard metallic impact against the engine cowling. The engine hesitated, then continued running, rougher now. Behind him, another Panther ground to a halt, smoke bleeding from its rear. The column scattered once more. Carpenter circled at a distance, heart pounding, checking instruments. Oil temperature was climbing. Controls still responded, though the aircraft felt wounded, like an animal refusing to collapse. He lined up for another pass. Infantry fire erupted early, tearing through fabric and frame. He fired again and climbed away blindly, not daring to look back until he reached safer altitude. This time the result was unmistakable. A Panther burned openly, flames pouring from its turret. Destroyed. But the cost was written into the aircraft itself. The tail fabric was shredded. Control response lagged. The rudder felt soft and unreliable. Staying longer meant pushing his luck beyond reason. Carpenter turned west, limping back toward base. The engine still ran, but the plane was no longer whole. As he headed home, a radio call cut through the cockpit. An American waterpoint crew had been trapped. Roughly 20 men. No heavy weapons. 4 Panther tanks, closing in. Artillery could not be used without risking friendly fire. Air support was unavailable. They needed help now. Carpenter looked at his fuel, his damaged plane. The obvious choice was to land and survive, but obvious choices did not save trapped men. He turned back toward the coordinates, knowing full well the Germans would not be surprised this time. Below him, 4 Panthers advanced on defenseless Americans. Above them, a damaged observation plane, armed with dwindling rockets, lined up for one last fight. And Carpenter understood that this next attack would decide far more than his own survival. Carpenter descended fast, dropping low enough to skim the landscape, using tree lines and shallow rises for cover. The damaged grasshopper protested every correction. The engine rattled. The controls felt loose, unreliable. Ahead, he saw the Waterpoint crew clearly now. Trucks clustered in a small clearing. American soldiers crouched behind wheels and crates, rifles useless against steel monsters. For Panthers rolled toward them with steady confidence. German infantry fanned out, weapons already angled skyward. They were waiting for him. He climbed just enough to set up the attack, then pushed the nose down harder than before. This dive was steeper, more aggressive. Gunfire erupted instantly. Tracers slashed through the air. Carpenter fired 2 rockets in quick succession. The plane bucked violently. He pulled back on the stick and felt it go soft in his hand. The aircraft responded late, barely clearing the German position. Both rockets exploded short, near misses. Dirt and debris flew, but the Panthers kept moving. The engine screamed in protest. Oil temperature surged into the red. Smoke streaked across the windscreen. Carpenter leveled off, breathing hard, and saw the situation below deteriorating. The tanks were closer now. American soldiers had stopped firing, conserving ammunition, bracing for the inevitable. He had seconds to rethink everything, instead of climbing for another predictable dive. Carpenter dropped even lower, nearly brushing the treetops. The Germans had aimed their guns high, expecting him to come from above again. He approached from the side, hidden until the last moment. Then he popped up, rolled into a brutal dive, and fired. 2 rockets struck the lead Panther. One punched through the turret ring. The other tore into the engine compartment. Flames erupted instantly. The tank stopped dead. Crewmen bailed out, uniforms burning. Carpenter stayed low, banking hard despite the damaged controls, and lined up the next target. Another rocket hit squarely. A second Panther burned. Chaos followed. German infantry scattered. The remaining tanks hesitated, unsure whether they were under air attack or something worse. Carpenter's engine began to fail outright, coughing and grinding. He had only a handful of rockets left and a plane that was barely flying. He made one final pass. One rocket slammed into a Panther's tracks, immobilizing it. The last tank pressed forward alone. Carpenter armed everything remaining. The engine seized briefly, then caught again, screaming. He dove lower than ever, fired all remaining rockets, and pulled up with everything the wounded aircraft had left. The final Panther exploded violently, torn apart from the inside. Below, 20 American soldiers were alive. Above them, Carpenter's Grasshopper was dying, and as he turned back toward base with a silent engine and shredded wings, gravity began to decide how the story would end. The engine went quiet for good as Carpenter turned west. No sputter this time, no second chance. Just wind rushing past torn fabric and the uneasy silence of a plane that had become a glider. Oil smeared across the windscreen, blurring the horizon. He trimmed for best glide, fighting damaged controls that no longer responded cleanly. The Grasshopper was never meant to glide like this. Not with uneven weight, ripped wings, and a wounded tail. The runway at Loneville appeared ahead. Heartbreakingly close, and still impossibly far. Ground crews were already moving, seeing the smoke trail, sensing disaster. Carpenter calculated quickly. He was too low. He would not make the strip. Pushing for it would mean hitting trees or buildings at speed. Off to the side, a plowed field stretched out, soft earth, ugly but survivable. He aimed for it. The descent felt slow and inevitable. 50 feet, 30. He eased back on the stick, flaring gently. The tail wheel touched first, then the mains dug into mud. The plane pitched forward violently. The propellers struck earth and shattered. The Grasshopper flipped and came to rest upside down, wings crushed, fuel leaking freely. Carpenter hung in his harness, inverted, fuel dripping onto his flight suit. The smell of gasoline filled the cockpit. He knew he had seconds. He released the straps and dropped hard onto the roof. The side door was jammed. He kicked once. Nothing. Kicked again. The frame gave way. He crawled out, rolled clear, and ran until his legs failed beneath him. Fire crews smothered the wreck in foam just in time. Medics checked him over. Cuts, bruises, no broken bones. He had flown directly into anti-aircraft fire again and again and walked away. The results were undeniable. In a single day, Carpenter had stopped for Panther tanks. 2 burned. 2 immobilized. 20 American soldiers survived because an observation pilot refused to accept his assigned role. Rosie the Rocketer was destroyed, but the idea was proven. A fabric plane with bazookas could change the battlefield, even if it should never have survived doing so. And as Carpenter sat on the edge of an ambulance, watching smoke drift from the wreckage, he already knew this would not be his last mission. Because once a weapon proves it can bite, the war demands it be used again. 3 days later, Charles Carpenter was back in the air. The Army gave him another L for Grasshopper, freshly painted, lightly repaired, and once again never designed for what he intended to do with it. The same modifications returned to the wings, the same name painted on the cowling. Rosie the Rocketer lived again. Word of his actions spread quickly through the 4th Armored Division. Tank crews who had felt abandoned days earlier now looked to the sky, hoping to spot a small fabric plane that meant German armor was about to have a very bad day. Between September and December of 1944, Carpenter flew more than 60 additional attack missions. Official records credited him with 6 tanks destroyed, including Tigers and Panthers, along with armored cars and supply vehicles. Unofficial accounts from ground troops suggested the real number was far higher. Many of his attacks happened miles ahead of American lines, where confirmation was impossible. What was confirmed was the effect. German units no longer ignored observation planes. Infantry were ordered to fire on them immediately. Tank commanders posted spotters, whose only job was to watch the sky for small aircraft with tubes on their wings. The Germans gave him a name. The Mad Major. Carpenter accepted it without ceremony. He believed war demanded constant pressure. Attack now. Attack again. Never give the enemy time to breathe. His tactics forced changes in German behavior and bought critical hours during moments when American armor was at its most vulnerable. Then the war turned on him in a way no tank ever could. In early 1945, doctors diagnosed Carpenter with Hodgkin's disease. Terminal. 2 years to live, they said. He was 32. He had survived machine guns, flak, and steel giants. Cancer would be the thing that ended him. Except it did not. Carpenter was promoted, decorated, and discharged honorably. He returned home to Illinois and went back to teaching history. The classroom replaced the cockpit. Years passed. 2 became 5. 5 became 10. He kept living. He kept teaching. He outlived every prediction made about him. Charles Carpenter died in 1966 at the age of 53, more than 2 decades after doctors said he should be gone. His grave lists his rank in his service. Nothing more. No mention of Bazooka, no mention of Rosie, no mention of the day, a history. Teacher flew a fabric plane into tanks and won, and yet the story survived. Decades later, historians rediscovered his aircraft, restored it, and returned Rosie, the Rocketer, to the sky. Proof that sometimes, the smallest machines and the most unlikely people leave the deepest marks on history. And if you think bravery always comes wrapped in steel and firepower, remember this. Sometimes it comes with canvas wings, borrowed weapons, and a man who refused to keep watching others die. This is where the story ends. Like this video to keep real history alive. Subscribe for more untold war stories, and comment where you are watching from.